Well, good morning. It's Dr. Kremens. I wanted to talk a little bit about the Toni Morrison piece that you're reading for this week, and I'm going to mention a couple things with the Morrison piece. First of all, how it fits in with the Mike Rose, and as I've mentioned before, as we think about the first paper, both the Mike Rose and the Toni Morrison essays are models for what you're going to be doing with the first paper. First paper for class, and hopefully you've had a chance by now to read the directions for it, is all about a job either that you've had, or as I mentioned in the other video, that maybe someone that you've interviewed, if you've decided that you wanted to write about a friend or a family member. That's the focus. So it's a narrative paper, and so both of these essays are good models of that because they tell good stories. And that's partly what you're going to be doing with this paper. You're going to have a quotation. As I mentioned, you are going to use a passage from Mike Rose in the last paragraph, just to sort of make a comparison between your ideas and your experience, and then Mike Rose's in his essays. But part of the goal for this paper is just to kind of get back into the swing of things, right? Especially if it's been a while since you wrote a paper, a few months, maybe several years, depending on the last time you took an English class. So I always like to start all of my writing classes with a more narrative driven paper, because that gives you the opportunity to tell a story that you're familiar with, one of your stories, while also developing or redeveloping skills that you already have. You've done papers for other classes, I'm sure, over the years. And sometimes it just takes a little bit of time to sort of get back into the rhythm of writing these kinds of essays. And so that's partly what I'm going to talk about in this video. And I'll also talk about how to use these two essays as models, as sort of examples of how to tell your story. It's sort of in the same way that these two writers do, because you're going to notice, particularly with the Morrison piece, and I hope you enjoyed it, by the way. As I mentioned in the last video, she's an excellent writer. To put it mildly, this is a Nobel Prize winning American novelist who, over the course of her career, wrote several amazing novels. You're probably familiar with Beloved, which is her most well-known book. It was turned into a film probably like 20 years ago now. I particularly like a novel called Home, which is one of the ones she wrote not long before she passed away. It's an excellent story about a World War II veteran coming back and trying to save his sister who's gotten into some danger back home. So it's just an amazing book, and her sense of narrative is always really, really strong. So if you haven't read her before, I hope you've enjoyed this essay. And in a second, I'll do a screen share, and that way you'll get to kind of get a sense of some of the parts of the article that you might find especially interesting. I should also mention we're outside again today. I'm over here in sort of our herb garden on our porch. It's kind of hard to see it with my computer here. So we've got some cola plant. This is actually a plant that does taste kind of like Coca-Cola or like Pepsi. If you break it up and put it in some tea or some water. We've got some oregano over here, which is really good, not only in food, but if you have a cold or something, you can make a tincture out of it. A lot of good stuff over here. There's also some catnip. I just gave Rosie some catnip, but she's not currently sitting with me. She's down on the other part. On the other part of the porch, where she's catching some sun. If she comes up here, I promise that I'll show her to you. But she enjoyed her fresh catnip from our herb garden here this morning. So let me do a screen share now and show you some of the things that I've actually put up on Blackboard. I apologize also again for the train, which you'll hear in the background. So first things first, and hopefully you're seeing my screen now. This is a sheet that I put up in all my classes. With some modifications depending on which class it is. And this is just a checklist. A lot of you have asked me some good questions about things I'll be looking for as I read your first papers and grade them when they come in. And so this is a good basic overview. So this is up on Blackboard. Please take a look at it. It's got some good basic information and some of the basic grammatical and style things I look for in your papers. So for example, there's some information here on use of citations, which we're not using a lot in this paper. It's really only in the last paragraph where you're going to be quoting from Mike Rose. We're going to use that much more in paper number 2 when we're using the Susan Sontag essay. There's more quoted cited material in that one. And then there's some other basic information. I'm just going to quickly go through this. Read it on your own, because again, this is a basic checklist of things that I look for when I'm reading your papers. So there's information here on how to use quotation marks correctly, run-on sentences versus sentence fragments. I'll talk about those more in a separate video, but those again are some very basic errors that I see that are easy to fix. I'm sure you're familiar with them. These are also the kind of grammatical things that I'll look for as I'm grading your papers. You're not going to fail for having run-on sentences or having sentence fragments, but I'll correct them because in order to communicate your ideas effectively, you want to make sure you're writing as clearly as possible. That's also in terms of grammatically speaking. So we'll talk about that in a separate video, but that's a common error that I see with especially papers early in English 101. So there's examples here of run-on sentences versus sentence fragments, how to correct them. So take a look at that. There's some other smaller grammatical things, use of pronouns like I as the subject of sentences. And then again, there's an overview of MLA format. And a lot of you have said, well, how do I do it? What advice can you give me on writing? And so the piece of advice I'll give you this week, I'll try to give you maybe a new piece of advice every week, not just things that I think will be helpful for this class, but also for your other classes, particularly when you're writing papers. And this may sound very basic, but one of the things I will tell you always to do is read over the directions. I know that sounds very simplistic, but I think you'll find a lot of things in life will go much more easy if you've read the directions carefully. And if you've had a chance to take a look at the directions for paper number one, you already see how I write my directions, where I make them fairly detailed, and I also kind of give you a suggested structure for the paper in the prompt itself. Now, that certainly doesn't mean that you have to answer every single question that I've asked you in the prompt for the paper, because that would make the paper too long. And also, a lot of those questions are there in case you get stuck. If you're working on something and you get stuck, I build the prompts in such a way that I hope that they'll be very helpful for you as you're writing. So that's one big piece of advice that I can definitely offer you. Read those directions, all right? Now, as we wait for the train to go past, let me switch over here and show you the Toni Morrison essay. So the Toni Morrison piece, and here I am on the New Yorker, and again, this is under the folder for paper number one, under the readings, quizzes, and writing assignments tab on Blackboard. So you'll always find your readings there. Again, the bulk of them are links to online articles. I have a couple of scans in there, and some of these are readings maybe that I'm trying out for the first time this semester, or that I don't have an electronic version of, but those are also short readings. But the Toni Morrison piece is in the same folder as the Mike Rose one that you read for last week. So one thing you're going to immediately notice with this essay is that it's even more narrative based than the Mike Rose. So there's less of that sort of if you want to call it sociological analysis in this one. It's very much a straightforward narrative about her experiences at her first job. So you can kind of see how these two pieces fit together in terms of what you're writing about. You're writing about a job experience that you had that maybe was challenging, maybe was rewarding for this first paper. So I wanted you to see two example essays that engage with those ideas. You see Mike Rose writing about his origins as a teacher, his mother's work at the diner, his uncle's work at the automobile factory. And in this one, you're seeing Toni Morrison writing about this first job she had in the early 1940s when she was a little girl in Ohio, and had to do some ridiculous stuff. If I'm being honest, I mean, she's being asked to move like bookshelves. She's too small to do this, but the person that she's working for is asking her to do all these things in her house, and this is where she makes a little bit of money, and it's exciting for her because, as she says here in the third paragraph of the piece, she said she took pride in this. Part of my pride for working for her, and you'll notice she never names her employer. She only capitalizes the H in her in the pronoun, because again, she's probably remembering this as an adult and remembering how intimidated she was by this person, how tall this person looked to her. Even the woman that she's working for also comes from a very different class. Toni Morrison's from a working class African-American family. She's working for this wealthier white woman. So there's a lot of differences between them. But she says, why did she want to take this job? Well, she could make money to go to movies, to buy candy, to buy Jack's ice cream cones, the things that little kids enjoyed doing in the early 1940s, and that we still enjoy doing. We still like going to movies, and we still like having ice cream, right? So it's not that different even 80 years later. So at the beginning, you get this description of the differences between her family and the family that she's working for. And she goes through this. She gives you a lot of information that kind of indicates what life was like in the early 1940s, which was the era of my grandparents. So I heard a lot about that as a kid from them when I was growing up. But you kind of get descriptions of what life was like then, especially at the beginning of World War II. So that's the era that this is set in when Toni Morrison was a kid. And so eventually, at the very end of the essay, this is interesting. What she does is she relates to us a conversation she had with her father, and her father gives her some advice on how best to be in the world and to work at a job that maybe is not ideal and maybe is not one that you particularly like. So I want to read the 4 pieces of advice she remembers that her dad gave to her when she was a little girl doing this job. And this is very similar also, if you want to make a note of this, to Mike Rose, where the main point of the essay is actually at the end. Now, again, we're going to keep to a pretty traditional format with this essay where, you'll have your main ideas at the beginning. As I said, you're going to identify the skills that you needed for this particular job that you're writing about in the opening paragraph. But these 2 writers, very experienced older writers who were used to writing narrative, kind of reverse the structure. I think that's a way to sort of gain your attention. A couple of you in your emails have mentioned to me the idea of an attention getter, trying to engage the audience when you're writing, which is always significant. And these writers do it by flipping the normal structure. So it's unusual. It's not the typical structure that one would be accustomed to in essays. And I think it makes for kind of interesting writing. A lot of the other pieces that we're going to read are going to have the more traditional essay format where the main idea is at the beginning and the thesis is there. But these 2 writers sort of reverse it. They kind of build up, they kind of gain your trust basically by telling these stories, gaining your interest, and then leading you to a lesson at the end, almost in the way you'd read like a fable or a parable, where the lesson, the main idea of the story is at the very end of it. So here's the 4 main ideas in this piece that she gets from her dad, who gives her some advice after she's, I think, probably expressed some frustration for obvious reasons with this job. Here are the 4 things that he tells her. Number 1, whatever the work is, do it well, not for the boss, but for yourself. 2, you make the job, it doesn't make you. 3, your real life is with us, your family. So you see that emphasis on family and how significant it is in this essay. Very similar, by the way, to Mike Rose. And that's why I've always enjoyed teaching these 2 essays together, because not only is the theme of working and the job connected, but you also have this connection to the idea of family, which is clearly at the center of what Mike Rose is also writing about in his essay. And then lastly, the most important one, you are not the work you do, you are the person you are. So think about all those for a minute, especially as the train passes by again here. You've got 4 lessons that she gathers and she elaborates on them. So if you look at the bottom of the article, the last paragraph, and this is again her definitely writing from this adult perspective, reflecting back on these experiences many, many decades later. Here's what she says. She says, "I have worked for all sorts of people since then. Geniuses and morons, quick-witted and dull, big-hearted and narrow. I've had many kinds of jobs, but since that conversation with my father, I've never considered the level of labor to be the measure of myself, and I've never placed the security of a job above the value of home." So now remember, Mike Rose was writing about ideas on democracy and the idea of respecting different types of work in order to have a really democratic, strong society where everybody has a voice and everyone is able to contribute and work towards the common good, right? This one is focused in a similar theme, but on using the family as the kind of foundation for that kind of a society, these strong family ties and connections that give you that kind of strength in order to be the best you can be not just in your workplace, but within those family and friend relationships that you have. So I think of these as very complementary essays. They're very similar in their themes. They're very much connected in the descriptions that these 2 writers give you. And hopefully they'll give you some idea of how to approach your paper. So let me stop the screen share here. I don't know if you heard that, but I have a guest here who has come to visit us. Let me see if you can see her. Yep, there she is, standing next to, pretty close to where her catnip plant is. She says hello. We've got some of our drawing stuff after we finish some schoolwork today. We're going to do a little bit of drawing this afternoon with the nice weather that we're having. But those are some suggestions. So let me just sum up. I can hear another train coming, so I'm going to let that pass. And as it does, and you can see it in the background. Actually, I'm realizing the way I'm faced this morning, you can actually see the red line tracks here behind me. It's a beautiful day out today, as you can see. Hopefully, where you are, it is as well. So to sum up, two things. First of all, read that list, that editing list that I put up on Blackboard. Again, those are very basic reminders that I'm sure you're all familiar with, but these will kind of give you an idea of some of the technical stuff that I'll make sure that I edit when you send me your papers and when I'm reading them, or when you send me drafts. And as I've mentioned before, I'm happy to read a draft if you want to send me one and you want me to start taking a look at it. Some of you actually already have, and I appreciate that. And I'm happy to read the drafts. I'm happy to meet with you over Zoom. We're not doing a Zoom check-in this week. We'll do another one next week. I do it every 2 weeks at the start of the semester. So read that list over, and then read the Toni Morrison, but read it in connection to the Mike Rose, and ask yourself, what can you learn from this writer? What can you learn by the way they put their story together, and how can you use that as a model? So think about their process. How did they put it together? How are they using some of these examples to engage your interest and also to communicate their main idea to you? So those are two things to really think about as you're reading the articles and you start thinking about paper number one. So with that, let me get back to doing some paperwork for school here, and I probably need to feed this kitty here. I think it's lunchtime for her now. So please email me if you have any questions. I'll be back tomorrow with an end of the week update as we start getting ready to do these first papers here coming up next in our class. So I hope you're having a great week. Hope you're enjoying the weather and that you're settling into your schedule for the semester. Email with any questions, and I will see you, or at least email you tomorrow with some of the summary of the update for the week. Talk to you then. Bye.